The stagecoach left Clara Whitmore in the middle of a sea of mud that Crestfall, Wyoming called a main street. It was late April of 1887, and the world smelled of wet earth and thawing promises. She clutched the handle of her single trunk, its leather worn smooth by 10 years of service in other people's houses. Inside the lining of her heavy wool coat, stitched into the seams with her own neat, precise governess stitches, was every dollar she had saved. And in her hand, wrapped in oilcloth, was a deed. Red Hollow Ranch. It had a nice sound to it. She had paid $1 for it at a foreclosure auction in Cheyenne, a property nobody wanted, stripped bare by drought and debt. To her, it was not an ending. It was the first solid thing she had ever owned. The walkout was longer than she had anticipated, the road a set of ruts dissolving into the prairie. The sky was immense, a pale, washed-out blue that made her feel impossibly small. By the time the shape of a house and a great, sway-backed barn rose from the rolling land, the sun was low and bleeding orange across the horizon. The place looked skeletal. A house with vacant eyes for windows, a barn that listed like a tired old man, and fences that lay down in the grass as if they had given up the fight. A profound silence settled over the valley, broken only by the sigh of the wind through dry grass. This was it. This was hers. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. She left her trunk on the porch of the locked house and walked toward the barn, the big double doors hanging slightly ajar. The air inside was thick with the scent of old hay, dust, and something else. Something warm and alive. In the deepening gloom of a vacant stall, a man was asleep on a pile of straw. He was long and lean, dressed in worn denim and a flannel shirt that had been mended more than once. A dark beard shadowed a jawline that looked like it had been carved from the unforgiving rock of the surrounding hills. He was not a vagrant. The boots by his side were scuffed but of good quality, the leather cared for. He stirred as her shadow fell over him, and his eyes opened. They were a startling, clear blue, and for a moment they held only the confusion of a man waking in his own bed. Then came the awareness, and then a deep and simmering anger. He sat up slowly, every movement radiating a coiled tension. He did not speak. He just watched her, this strange woman standing in the doorway of his barn. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a small cage. She had expected emptiness, not this. Not a man who looked at her as if she were the final, bitter joke in a long and tragic story. "I am Clara Whitmore," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I own this place now." The man got to his feet. He was taller than she had thought, broad through the shoulders, a solid presence that filled the space. He picked up a dusty hat from a nail on the stall post and settled it on his head, the brim shadowing his face. "This is Red Hollow," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough with disuse. "It belongs to the Danners. It has for 3 generations. The bank in Cheyenne says it belongs to me," she countered, holding her ground. She would not be intimidated. She had faced down petulant children and condescending employers for a decade. This was just a man, a broken one by the looks of him. "The bank can say what it likes," he stated, taking a step toward her. "This is my home. You need to leave." "I can't do that," Clara said simply. "I have the deed. I have nowhere else to go." He stopped, his gaze sweeping over her. He saw the plain, durable dress, the determined set of her chin, the one trunk on the porch behind her. He saw a woman who was not a threat, but an obstacle. An infuriating, final obstacle. "My name is Caleb Danner," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "And you are standing on my land. Give me back my ranch." The plea was raw, stripped of pride, a desperate demand from a man with nothing left to lose. Clara looked from his haunted eyes to the dilapidated barn around them, to the fallow fields beyond. She saw the ghost of what this place had been, written in the solid lines of the hand-hewn beams and the proud, lonely stance of the house. She had come here for a piece of earth to call her own, but this man was rooted in it, torn from it like a tree from the soil, leaving a raw and gaping hole. An idea took shape, born of pragmatism and a surprising flicker of empathy. It was a gamble, but her entire life was a gamble now. "I will not," she said, her tone firm. "But I will offer you something else." He waited, his silence heavy and skeptical. "This ranch is a mystery to me," she admitted. "I know numbers and letters. I don't know fences and wells. You do. Stay for 30 days. Teach me what I need to know to keep this place from falling into dust. Work for me. In exchange for your labor, you'll have a roof and food. At the end of the month, we'll be settled. You can leave, and I can try to make a go of it on my own." He stared at her, his blue eyes narrowed, searching for the trick. He had been tricked before, by fine print and smiling men in city suits. He had lost this land because he had trusted a man he should not have, because he had not read a loan document closely enough to see the poison in its pages. The drought had been the killing blow, but the fraud had been the wound that festered. To stay here, on his own land, as a hired hand for a woman who bought it for $1? The indignity was a physical blow. But then he looked around. The barn, his great-grandfather's barn, was leaning. The fences were down. The well, he knew, was choked with debris. Leaving meant letting it all die. Staying was a torment. But it was also a chance to touch it, to tend to it, one last time. 30 days, he said, the words clipped. "And I sleep in the barn." "That seems fair," Clara agreed. "The house is mine." He nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. "Work starts at sunrise. The north fence line is down. We'll start there." He turned his back on her then, a clear dismissal, and began methodically cleaning a piece of harness leather with a scrap of burlap. The conversation was over. A deal had been struck. Clara retreated to the porch, her legs trembling slightly. She slid the key the bank had given her into the lock of the front door. It turned with a grating screech. The air that met her was stale and cold, the smell of abandonment. But as she stepped across the threshold, she felt a flicker of triumph. She had not run. She had stood her ground, and she had forged a truce. For 30 days, Red Hollow would have 2 keepers. And she, Clara Whitmore, for the first time in her life, was home. The first week was a battle of silences. They worked from sunup to sundown, the space between them charged with unspoken resentment on his part and determined focus on hers. Caleb was a demanding teacher. He did not offer praise, only terse corrections. "Hold the post steady," he would command, his voice flat as he stretched the new wire tight. "Not like that. Brace it with your foot." Clara, her hands raw and her muscles aching in ways she never knew possible, would adjust her stance without complaint. She learned the heft of a post-hole digger, the sharp bite of wire cutters, the rhythm of hammering staples into cedar posts. She watched the way he moved, with an economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime of this work. The way he could sight a straight fence line by eye, the way he tested the tension of a wire with a flick of his thumb. He was a part of this land, and teaching her to care for it felt, she suspected, like teaching a stranger how to care for a beloved, dying relative. He watched her, too. He had expected a flighty city woman who would give up after the first blister. But she was not that. She was quiet, she was observant, and she was relentless. She never complained about the cold mornings or the back-breaking labor. She would simply nod, her jaw set, and do what he had told her. He saw the new calluses forming on her palms and felt a grudging respect. Evenings were the hardest. He would retreat to the barn, to the familiar scent of hay and his own solitary misery. She would disappear into the house. From the barn door, he could see the single square of yellow light from her kitchen window. Sometimes, The scent of baking bread or a simple stew would drift across the yard, a painful reminder of the life that had once filled that house. His mother's life. His wife's, before she was taken by fever 2 years before the drought even began. The house had been silent for a long time before the bank took it. Now, that single light felt like a new and different kind of haunting. One evening, after a grueling day clearing the silt and a dead badger from the main well, Clara approached the barn. She carried a plate, covered with a clean cloth. Caleb was sitting on an overturned bucket, sharpening an axe blade with a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape the only sound in the dusky air. She stopped a few feet away. "I made too much," she said, her voice soft. She held out the plate. It was a simple meal of beef stew and a thick slice of fresh bread. He looked at the plate, then at her face, shadowed in the twilight. He saw no pity there, only a simple, practical statement, an unspoken gesture. He hesitated for a long moment before he wiped his hands on his trousers and took the plate from her. "Thank you," he mumbled, the words feeling foreign. She just nodded and retreated back to the house, leaving him alone with the warm plate and a confusing tangle of feelings. The stew was good. It was nourishing and real, and as he ate, the knot of bitterness in his stomach loosened just a fraction. It was the first meal he had not cooked for himself over a sad little fire in months. The quiet between them began to change after that. It was still there, but it was less a wall and more of a shared space. They started talking, not about the past or the future, but about the work. "That top hinge on the stable door needs reseating," he said one morning, gesturing with his chin. "It'll tear clean off in a high wind." "I don't have the tools for that," she replied. "There's a forge in the workshop," he said. "Grandfather built it. I can fix it." She watched him later that day, standing before the heat of the small forge, his face illuminated by the glow of the hot metal. He worked with a focused grace, the hammer blows ringing out in a steady musical rhythm. He was not just fixing a hinge. He was breathing life back into a piece of his family's history. He was showing her, without words, the soul of the place. A few days later, she noticed the sleeve of his work shirt was torn, a long gash from a snagged nail. That evening, after he had gone to the barn, she took the shirt from the hook where he left it to air out. She brought it into the house and, by the light of her lamp, she mended it. Her stitches were small and even, a neat line of repair that was almost invisible. She was a governess. Mending was as natural to her as breathing. She hung the shirt back on the hook before dawn. He noticed the repair as soon as he put it on. He ran his thumb over the seam. It was stronger than the original fabric. He glanced toward the house, where a thin curl of smoke was now rising from the chimney. He said nothing about it. He did not need to. It was a conversation held in thread and steel, in bread and sweat. The town of Crestfall watched them. When Clara went in for supplies, Mr. Gable at the general store would peer at her over his spectacles. "Heard you got Caleb Danner working for you out at the old place," he commented one afternoon, weighing out a sack of flour. "He is helping me for a time," Clara said, keeping her tone neutral. "Good," Gable nodded. "Man's been wandering like a ghost since the bank took it. Town looks out for him, but a man needs purpose. You seem to have given him some of that." He paused, adding a scoop of sugar to her order. "And he's teaching you right, I reckon. That place needs a firm hand." Mr. Gable's words stayed with her. Purpose. She had come here seeking her own, but perhaps she had stumbled into his as well. The thought was unsettling. Her plan had been simple. Learn what she needed, and then be alone. Independent. The presence of Caleb Danner complicated that clean, simple vision. He was becoming a fixture, as solid and necessary as the new fence posts they were sinking into the ground. His internal world was shifting too. The sharp edges of his grief were slowly being worn smooth by the daily rhythms of work and shared existence. He started to see Clara not as an intruder, but as a part of the landscape of Red Hollow. He noticed the way the wind caught a stray strand of her brown hair, the focused line of her brow when she was calculating a measurement, the quiet satisfaction in her eyes when they looked over a newly mended stretch of fence. He was not a man given to introspection. His feelings were things to be weathered, like storms or drought. But he could not deny the change in himself. The hollow ache in his chest was still there, but it was no longer all-consuming. There was something else growing in its place. Something quiet and steady and warm, like the light in her kitchen window. He was beginning to dread the end of the 30 days. The catalyst came not from a person, but from a stack of paper. On the 21st day of their arrangement, a cold rain settled over the valley, making outdoor work impossible. Caleb stayed in the barn, methodically oiling harness leather. Clara, confined to the house, felt a familiar restlessness. She needed a task, a problem to solve. Her gaze fell upon the small, battered chest where she kept her important documents. Inside were the foreclosure papers from the bank and, tucked in the bottom, a dusty set of old ranch ledgers she had found in a desk drawer. The bank had told her they were worthless, just old records. On a whim, she pulled them out. She cleared the kitchen table and opened the first ledger. The pages were filled with a looping, masculine script. Caleb's father, she presumed, and before that, his grandfather. A meticulous record of a family's life, told in numbers, cattle sold, seed purchased, debts paid. She then unrolled the foreclosure documents, the bank's neat, typed columns stark and impersonal against the worn pages of the ledger. For 10 years, Clara had managed household accounts for wealthy families. She had a mind for numbers, an instinct for spotting discrepancies. It was the one skill she truly owned. She began to cross-reference. Hours passed. The rain pattered against the window panes. The fire crackled in the stove. Clara worked, her brow furrowed in concentration. She started with the original loan Caleb's father had taken out. The terms were clear. Then she looked at the bank's statements. Something was wrong. A payment recorded in the Danner ledger for May of 1,884 was completely missing from the bank's records. It was a substantial payment made after a good cattle sale. Its absence had allowed the interest to compound, ballooning the debt. She kept digging. She found another discrepancy. The interest rate on the loan had been altered. The bank's copy showed a 2-point increase, but the small, faded note in the margin of the Danner ledger, in Caleb's father's hand, recorded the original, lower rate. There was no corresponding signature agreeing to a change in terms. It was subtle. A missing payment here, a tweaked percentage there. Over 3 years, these small, deliberate manipulations had created an insurmountable mountain of debt. The final piece fell into place when she read a name at the bottom of the bank's internal assessment. Mr. Thompson, the advisor who had managed the loan. She remembered seeing a geological survey map in the Cheyenne Land Office, a detail she had overlooked. A survey commissioned by a consortium represented by that same Mr. Thompson. It showed what local knowledge had always suspected. Red Hollow sat atop a significant, drought-proof aquifer. Its hidden water rights made the land worth 10 times its assessed value. It was not bad luck. It was not a simple failure to read the fine print. It was theft. A deliberate, calculated act of fraud designed to strip the Danners of their legacy so a richer man could claim the water beneath it. The discovery left her breathless. She sat back in her chair, the papers spread before her like a battlefield. This changed everything. This information did not belong to her. It belonged to the man in the barn. With these papers, Caleb could go to a judge. He could prove the fraud. He could nullify the foreclosure. He could take back the deed. He could get his ranch back. And she would be left with nothing. A $1 purchase, a month of back-breaking labor, and a coat full of useless savings. She would have to leave. The thought, which a month ago would have been a mere inconvenience, now landed with the force of a physical blow. Leave this place? Leave him? She was not going to be the one to say any of this first. She waited. She sat there for a long time, the rain whispering against the glass, the truth laid bare on the table. Her own quiet, desperate dream was now in direct conflict with his right to justice. She folded her hands in her lap, the calluses on her palms a testament to the work she had put into this soil. Her soil. For now. That evening she did not take a plate to the barn. She waited until the rain slowed to a drizzle and then walked across the muddy yard, her boots sinking into the wet earth. She carried the ledgers and the bank papers under her arm, protected by the oilcloth. Caleb was standing at the barn door, looking out at the bruised twilight sky. He turned as she approached, his expression unreadable. "The rain's letting up," he said. "A simple observation." "Caleb," she began, her voice tight. "We need to talk. Not about the rain." She led him back into the house. It was the first time he had set foot inside since the day of the auction. He stopped just inside the door, his gaze sweeping the room. It was clean. It was warm. A pot of coffee was on the stove. It looked like a home again. The sight of it was a fresh wound. "What is this?" he asked, his eyes falling on the papers spread across the table. "This is why you lost your ranch," Clara said quietly. She walked him through it piece by piece. She pointed to the missing payment in the bank's record and the corresponding entry in his father's ledger. She showed him the altered interest rate. She explained the significance of Mr. Thompson's name and the water rights. She laid out the anatomy of the fraud, with the same precision she had used to mend his shirt. He listened in absolute silence, his face a mask of stone. He leaned over the table, his big, work-roughened finger tracing the lines of his father's handwriting, then the cold, typed numbers from the bank. He saw it. He saw the lie he had lived with for over a year, the lie that had hollowed him out and left him sleeping in his own barn. The anger came first, a white-hot flash that made him want to ride to Cheyenne and drag Mr. Thompson out into the street. But that was followed by a wave of crushing shame. He had missed it. His father had missed it. They were men of the land, not of paper and ink, and they had been swindled by a man who wielded a pen like a weapon. And this woman, this stranger, had found it in a single afternoon. He finally straightened up, his back to the stove, and looked at her. She stood by the table, her hands clasped before her, her expression steady and solemn. She was giving him the weapon to win his war. She was handing him back his life, and in doing so, erasing her own. "You can take these to the territorial judge," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He will see the fraud. They will have to give you the deed back. It will be yours again, free and clear." He waited. The silence in the small kitchen was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece, a clock that had been his mother's. He was not looking at the papers anymore. He was looking at her. He saw the quiet courage it took for her to stand there and hand him the means of her own eviction. He saw the woman who had met his anger with a practical offer, who had worked beside him without complaint, who had mended his shirt and shared her meals and slowly, quietly, begun to fill the desolate spaces in his life. He thought of the 30 days they had agreed to. He thought of the silence that was no longer empty. He, though, of the light in her window. If he took the deed, that light would go out. Red Hollow would be his again, but it would be as empty as it was the day she arrived. The truth of it settled in his bones, a certainty more solid than the land itself. He had been mourning a place, but a place was just dirt and timber. A home was something else entirely. "I was a fool," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a fool to lose it, and a bigger fool for not seeing this." He gestured to the papers. "But I would be the biggest fool of all to get it back this way." Clara looked at him, confused. "But it's your right. It's justice." "Is it?" he asked, taking a step toward her. He stopped on the other side of the table, the evidence of his stolen past lying between them. "The ranch I lost, It was just a name on a deed. It was an obligation. A ghost. For the past month, working with you, this place has started to feel different. He drew a deep breath, the words coming hard and slow, forged in the quiet of his heart. I have been a slow man, Clara. Slow to anger, slow to hope. It has taken me this long to understand what I was really missing. It was not just the land. He looked directly into her eyes, and she saw an earnestness there that stole her breath. I would like to stay, Clara, he said, the words simple and direct. Not as a hired hand. The bank took the land, but you found the heart of it. That makes it more yours than it ever was mine alone. He paused, his next words the biggest gamble of his life. I would like to stay as your husband. I would like to build this place back with you. Together. She stared at him, her mind reeling. This was not a possibility she had allowed herself to imagine. A partner. A husband. A home that was more than just a piece of property. It was everything she had secretly, desperately wanted, but had never dared to name. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of shock and a profound, overwhelming relief. It took you long enough, she whispered, a small, watery smile touching her lips. A slow grin spread across Caleb's face, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. It transformed his entire countenance, chasing away the last of the shadows. Yes, he said. Obviously, yes. The courtship was as practical and steady as the two people involved. There were no grand gestures, only a deepening of the partnership they had already forged. They ate their meals together at the kitchen table. They worked side by side during the day, their conversations shifting from the necessities of the ranch to the quiet details of their lives. He told her about his parents, about the wife he had lost, about the pride and the burden of the Danner name. She told him about her 10 years as a governess, the loneliness of living in other people's homes, her fierce, quiet dream of having something of her own. On Sundays, they would ride the fence line, not to check for breaks, but simply to see the land, their land, stretching out under the vast Wyoming sky. The shared quiet between them was now a comfortable, settled thing, rich with unspoken understanding. They decided to use the evidence of the fraud not to reclaim the old deed, but as leverage. With a lawyer from Cheyenne, they presented the papers to Mr. Thompson and the bank. Faced with public scandal and a legal battle they were certain to lose, the bank settled. They canceled the outstanding phantom debt, paid a handsome sum in damages for the fraud, and formally ceded any and all claims to Red Hollow and its water rights. The money, which Clara insisted they share, was enough to buy a small herd of good cattle, new equipment, and everything they would need to make the ranch thrive again. The deed remained in her name, a fact Caleb insisted upon. You bought it, you found the truth of it, he said. We'll build it on your foundation. They were married 3 months after the day she first arrived, in the small church in Crestfall. Mr. Gable from the general store stood as Caleb's witness. The whole town seemed to turn out, their faces reflecting a quiet, communal satisfaction. Clara wore a simple blue dress she had ordered from a catalog, and in her hair she wore a sprig of wild sage Caleb had picked for her that morning. The ceremony was short, the words plain and solid. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Caleb took her hand, his grip warm and sure. It felt like coming home. 5 years later, Clara stood on the porch of the house, watching the evening sun cast long shadows across the valley. The house was no longer skeletal. It was alive. The windows were clean, curtains hung in them, and a sturdy porch rail which Caleb had built ran the length of it. The barn no longer listed. It stood straight and proud, filled with hay and the soft sounds of contented livestock. The fences stretched out across the greening hills, strong and true. Caleb came to stand beside her, draping an arm around her shoulders. He smelled of hay and earth and soap. He pressed a kiss to her temple, a familiar, comfortable gesture. A small boy with his father's clear blue eyes and his mother's determined chin ran across the yard, chasing a chicken with a stick. A younger girl with Clara's dark hair sat on the steps, carefully trying to braid pieces of grass together. "He's got your stubbornness," Caleb said, his voice a low, content rumble as he watched their son. "And your complete inability to let a chicken have a moment's peace," Clara retorted, leaning her head against his shoulder. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, a silence built of 5 years of shared work, shared joys and shared sorrows. "Do you ever think about that first day?" she asked quietly. "Every day," he answered without hesitation. "I was so sure I knew what I wanted. I wanted my ranch back." He tightened his arm around her. "I was a slow man, Clara Danner. It took you coming here for me to figure out I didn't want the ranch. I wanted a home." She looked up at him, at the steady, honorable man who had been sleeping in the straw, and saw the entirety of her world. He had not been given his ranch back. She had not built her independent life. Instead, together, they had brought a hollow place back to life, and in doing so had built something far more valuable. They had built a future. The land was the foundation, but their partnership, forged in silence and sealed with a plain-spoken declaration, was the house they lived in, solid and true under the vast Wyoming sky.